What does the skin condition on my scalp have to do with Jesus' promise to his disciples in John chapter 14, verse 27? Stay tuned for this reflection as we talk about keeping our peace. Let's read. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. So in the first part, Jesus says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. And so he was talking to his disciples at this moment. And the disciples were aware of what Christ's peace entailed. They'd seen him heal the sick. They'd seen him have this sureness and security with the Father. They'd seen him have power over the elements. They'd seen that he had this true knowledge and true wisdom. They could see something in him that was much different, which is why they could leave their lives and their livelihoods to follow him. And that was part of his peace. And so when he promised this peace to them, they would understand what he was referring to. And so there are different definitions of peace in what we're talking about today. So we'll go over those in a second, but you could have maybe an internal peace or an external peace. So let's go to the next part where Jesus talks about how he says, I do not give to you as the world gives. So if we're talking about peace here, then let's think about the world gives outer peace or tries to give outer peace. And anything that the world is going to do would be the domain of the enemy or Satan. And so everything that the world does would be a poor imitation of what Christ offers. So it'd be like the McDonald's version of an amazing juicy steak if you're a meat eater or whatever other thing you might eat. Or the Great Value version that just was a little bit off, like Great Value Doritos. They aren't quite as good as Doritos, but they're similar. And so that's kind of the idea that whatever the world does is a cheap imitation. The world might promise peace through government. The world might promise peace in a given community. The world might promise peace as in tolerance, which, as we know in the United States, when somebody tells us to be tolerant, it's in fact telling us that they aren't tolerating us. But that is a worldly definition of peace, would be everybody tolerates one another in the sense of whoever says that. But maybe fixing people or fixing society can be what the world tries to do, whether that be through psychiatry, whether that be through school systems and ideologies and the school trying to teach our youth be more well-rounded, different things like that. So they might fix the individual, but ultimately they're trying to fix the society. And so as we come to this, what we can see is I had kind of 4 examples that I thought of when Jesus promises his peace and then talks about not giving them what the world gives. And so there is a situation where what's going on inside of you is not peace, it's turmoil, or it could be fear. And so there's turmoil on the world and there's turmoil inside of you. And so there could be another situation where there's peace going on around you, and yet there's turmoil on the inside. Something feels like you're not good. Then we get to peace on the inside, and there's turmoil on the outside. So things are bad on the outside, but on the inside you have peace. And then finally, we could have peace on the outside, and we could have peace on the inside. Well, so the world would most likely promise you peace. So maybe we could think of that, but it's going to be a temporary peace. So you might see the second one and the fourth one, that peace, but you could have turmoil on the inside or you could have peace on the inside. But because it's not lasting, then either of those situations are going to ultimately lead you back to the first one, which is turmoil and turmoil. Or it could lead you to turmoil and peace, but most likely if you're putting, as we looked at the last week with the 2 builders, if the storm comes and you don't have a good foundation, then, which is basically those who didn't trust in Christ's words or didn't put them into practice, they would be in turmoil when there is turmoil. So those things would go together. But peace would come from Christ. So the first one we could probably agree, not very good. Second one, if peace is going on the outside of you, but there's turmoil on the inside of you, for a person, that's still not very good. It's not ideal, right? So those are 2 non-ideals, right? The next 2, obviously, one of them is less ideal than the other. But from my experiences in general, if I have inner peace, that is better than having turmoil, right? So the turmoil on the outside would be what I would view the world right now, that there are things that are going on there. The government or whoever might promise peace, but then a disease happens, right? That completely changes things. People's entire livelihoods are upheaved, and people aren't able to pay their bills. People are worried about getting sick. We can see people, it's kind of turning into the Wild West at times, it feels like, from what the news talks about, with people saying, oh, my gun right here is my exemption from wearing a mask. You have all these really fascinating things going on, but it's ultimately showing that when you just pull the string a little bit, the government really doesn't have everlasting peace. So in any human-made institution, there will be problems eventually, sooner or later. And even in the United States, which I think has some great things going for it, there are still imperfections because it is made by humans and we are fallen. So that third one, turmoil and an inner peace, that's not ideal, but it's most likely the closest we're going to get right now. And then the peace on the outside and peace on the inside, that is the promise. That is the true promise that we can cleave to as Christians. That peace on the outside is going to be God's peace, everlasting. Not a moment, but actual everlasting peace. And so because of that, we will have inner peace because we're trusting in God's promise. But that even helps us in the third one. And in the third one, we see that we have that inner peace. Think about the builders, right? That you have that stuff, the storms going on the outside and the terrible things going on the outside. But because we can hold on to the future of being with God, the future of what's going to happen, then we can have peace now. And so when Jesus is talking about giving his disciples peace, he's not referring necessarily in the now to an outer peace, because soon he was going to be killed. And pretty much all the disciples, minus John, were going to be martyred. They were not going to experience an outer peace, but they were still able to do all that because of the inner peace that they had based on the promises of God through Christ. And so now we're going to go to the third point. So then Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. And this goes along with, again, that they're going to have outer struggles and outer problems and outer turmoil, but they could still have peace. So Christ must be referring to the inner peace for now. Promise of the outer peace is later. If you think about the two builders, we remember the storms are going to come, as I've already said. So there will be outer problems. There will be things outside of our experience, outside of our control that are going to happen. And what are we going to cleave to, right? What are we going to hold on to and anchor us in those storms? And that's going to be Christ for the peace to have peace. Otherwise, we go right back to the turmoil because the shaky foundation is made of sand. So peace, fear, and worry are forward thinking and looking, right? That peace comes from security. So I believe that I'm secure and what's going to happen. That could be through, in the worldly sense, that could be through, wealth or fame, etc. We know those will be taken away in an instant, potentially in a storm of some sort. But peace comes from a security or a belief in something that's going to take care of us in the end, right? Whereas fear and worry are going to come from insecurity. So if you don't have the belief that something's you're going to be taken care of, then you're going to most likely fear, or you're going to worry, or you're going to think about, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose this, I'm going to lose that, I'm going to lose that, because those things have importance and those things matter. But those things most likely are not the most important things. And so those things are thinking about what's to be lost, as opposed to when you have peace about what's going to be gained. And so in 2 Corinthians 10:5, we see Paul says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And so I've heard described before that our mind itself is a battlefield. Jesus says, don't let your hearts be troubled. And yes. But think about your mind is also a battleground. And for that reason, the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 6 talks about the helm of salvation. And that helm of salvation is, if you think about what protects your head and why your head needs protection, in a war scene where you would need armor, your head could be hit pretty easily with something and you would die, right? Other parts of your body you might still live, but your head was specifically susceptible. And so in our day-to-day life, your head is also the housing of your thoughts and the housing of thinking. So the salvation, to completely cover your thoughts with salvation, is going to remind you of Romans 8:1, which says that therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. If you can walk around every single day and think about there is no condemnation, that when I die, which I will die, but when I die, there is no condemnation. I can have inner peace. I don't have to have turmoil. So as Jesus tells the thief on the cross, surely today you'll be with me in paradise. We have the same promise that there's no condemnation. We will be with God in a place with outer peace, and then we will have inner peace. And by holding on to that promise, by anchoring ourselves in that truth, we can have inner peace even when the storms are going on and the turmoil is all around us and the lack of security and the lack of certainty is going on. But we can still trust in God and in his promises. And so I wanted to give you an example. So I mentioned this in the intro. I have a scalp condition and I've had it for a really long time, and it kind of comes and goes and it flares up and it goes away. But if you've ever heard of eczema or psoriasis, eczema is not quite as bad from what I know. But on my scalp and on my ears, if you ever see me picking or something, I have these little scaly parts of my skin, and like blood will rush to an area and then it will kind of dry it out and then it'll itch. And so because of the extra blood, it'll itch, and I'll pick at it and then it'll kind of come off as like a little scale or something, like a little just dry skin, but it won't go away. It'll actually slowly kind of create a larger pocket as I continue to pick at it, and it'll continue to itch. And so I think about fear and I think about worry kind of like that, right? So like back here, I started getting one recently. I started scratching at it, right? And as I started scratching at it, other parts of my head started itching. And so I would scratch here, and then before I knew it, I would be scratching over here, and I have one over here now. And then now that's starting to get larger. And then suddenly I noticed that I had another one up here. And as I continued to scratch, I would continue to find more and more places on my head that were developing eczema and that I needed to scratch. And then if I don't stop, then eventually it's going to cover my entire head, and it's going to be really, really gross. And so as I think about fear and worry, it starts so simply like that, right? That you have this little tiny like what if or what could happen if. And then as you follow that thought, then it's going to bring you to more worries and more insecurities and more until your brain cannot cope anymore because of all the worry and stress. I think eczema is a great example on the exterior of what goes on the interior sometimes when we aren't trusting in God. And so I want to encourage you today to take every thought captive, make it obedient to Christ. Whenever those fears and those worries start coming, put on the helm of salvation. Remind yourself that you are a child of God, that there is no condemnation for you if you are in Christ Jesus, that there will be problems in this life. There will be times of doubt and confusion from what the world has to offer us for these cheap imitations of trying to be like God and establishing peace. But ultimately, one day, we believe that we will be with God and that we will be truly, finally, in his place of peace and able to rest in him and to delight in him and to no longer have turmoil like we do now. And so rest in that security and have that peace that Christ promised to his disciples and that we can also take hold of today. And so I had a couple final questions for you. As usual, have you accepted Christ's peace that he talks to his disciples about? Are you confident in his promise? Are you experiencing fear right now or worry? Are you experiencing the peace of Christ? How can you experience his peace every day? If you aren't experiencing it, how can you put on that helm of salvation? Can you every morning reflect on the promises of God? Are you wearing the helm of salvation? Are you wearing that idea constantly, reminding yourself whenever the enemy attacks or whenever things get bad? Are you reminding yourself, I am a child of God, I'm saved, there's no condemnation for me in Christ Jesus? Are you taking every thought captive? As soon as some fear or worry starts developing, are you squashing it immediately and saying, that's not of God? I have security and confidence in God. Are you experiencing this peace? It is my prayer for you today and always that you would experience this peace, because there will be storms, there will be problems, there will be turmoil, until one day we are in his presence. God bless, and may you find His peace each day and share it with